Hey everybody, welcome back to another crash course video where today we're gonna take a look at Dutch-German coalition, and as always this is not an in-depth view. This is a very quick pseudo tutorial, if you will, just roughly how I build my decks. Usually they are oriented towards 1 versus 1 play, however I usually also mention what changes if you want to adjust this more for a team game version. That said, I will probably also soon make a fairly short, again, pseudo tutorial video, just how to roughly adjust 1 versus 1 decks to team games, but we'll see about that. Anyway, let's get into this. So logistics. Of course, infantry is always a good choice if you want to run no Jeep CVs, which I would generally suggest in 1 versus 1s. There's really no way to go around running 3 cards if you're playing ranked. And team games, 2 cards of these, or sometimes even 1, like a card of this or something, is more than enough. But in team decks, I run the Führungsgruppe in a Fuchs, the Dutch one in the Autocannon transport, so it comes with its own base defense, so to speak. And then a Leopard 1 CV for something more durable. It's 3 cards of CVs, which not everybody likes. So of course, you know, if you think 6 is enough, or really you run a Jeep CV, whatever, of course you can run only 2, but this is really not a crucial part of the deck. That's just a lot of personal preference. Infantry tab. In Eurocore not needed, but I think in Dutch-German coalition it's really crucial. It's the Marder 2. I like to run them with the Panzergrenz 90. They already cost 30 points. The Marder 2 already costs 30 points, so the extra 5 points for a much better AT version or AT weapon, definitely worth it in my eyes. I also upweighted because 55 points a pop and no real general purpose unit. I feel like you don't need this many. For my wheeled infantry, I run Corps Marinier 95 in the YP 408, solid wheeled transport. The infantry itself is one of the best 50-man elite squads in the game in my eyes. Carbine primary, best MG in the game. Solid AT weapons, nothing, you know, to write home about, but their anti-infantry DPS is just crazy good. What you can also run, which some people do, some people don't run them at all, and just run the Stottorp 95 in a wheeled transport. If you want, you know, wheeled transport, shock infantry for town fighting, something like that, both viable. I just like the Corps Marinier 95. With 15 men, it's also more easily, it's easier to keep them alive and then repair them again. But again, personal preference. That said, a card of Stottorp 95, that's just must-haves. They're incredibly one of the best shock squads in the game, pound for pound. They have a good 5-pointer, they have a good wheel transport, and even like a solid IFV. It's not amazing, but it's fine, right? I run a card of them in the 5-pointer. You can also run, like, I don't know, 2 cards upweighted or something. They're crazy good. They're just immensely good. And then I run a card of Grenadiers in the 5-pointer. Just solid spam infantry. They're very similar to riflemen. Slightly worse 5-point transport in that it has 2 instead of 3 side armor. But the infantry itself is slightly better because you get battle rifles, which generally perform better than assault rifles, at least on lower tier infantry. And you can of course also run the Natris, one of the best, if not the best, reservists in the game, because they get basically the best 5-pointer out of any reservists, and you still get like 35 of them, which is huge. Some other choices that don't fill the same role, but in general, units that you can maybe also use. Deckungsgruppe in the Marder 1 is okay. Wouldn't necessarily recommend, but you know. Fallschirmjäger are of course fan favorite very often. Jäger I would not recommend, and you can run like base Panzergrenz in the Marder 1, but if you do that, then you might as well just run Stottorp in the YPR with the autocannon. The Warplex, honestly, don't bother with them. So yeah, in this case, I'm just gonna use the Grenadiers for the spam, and then usually you see people here taking it to gems, which is fine. Milan 1 spam in the 5-pointer, good choice. Milan 2 in the 5-pointer, or the Fuchs Milan or just Space Fuchs, good choice. These days I actually run Fliegerfaust 2, which is, you know, not a lot of people do that. I think most people just choose the Milan 2, but especially for bigger maps and against decks with seed, just having the manpad can be nice. You can also just run, like, replace a Corps Marinier 95 or Panzergrenz if you want for a Milan, so you have 2 utility infantry slots, but that's not what I like to do. But you know, just letting you out there, it's perfectly fine, right? You just, you know, you gotta adjust your playstyle. If you play a certain way, then that might be better for you. My air tab, Our support tab is relatively low on AA. I actually only run one card of upwitted Roland and a card of upwitted Gepard A1s. All of the Gepards are perfectly fine. The Gepard A1 in my eyes is just, you know, the perfect middle point between availability and accuracy. Keep in mind that being a relatively advanced spec, you still get 7 upwitted, which is actually crazy. Gepard A2, of course, with a stinger if you struggle against Seed, and like a tiny bit more accuracy as well. Roland 3, I think, solid. The Roland 2 is also fine. All the Roland 3, they all work, right? All of these are solid choices for AA in general. The Hawks, they're okay, right? I think either go for the Pip 2 or the Heos Hawk. For 1 vs 1, I'm not a huge fan of the Heos Hawk most of the time. Because it's just so inconsistent that it just usually takes a couple of shots before you actually get value out of it. That said, if you struggle versus USA with its Raven and stuff like that, which this is the most susceptible deck together with Landjord against, you might want to put this in. That said, in team games, very good choice because you see a lot more Seed in team games in general as well. And the Hawk Pip 2 is also just in general a solid Hawk. But for the purposes of this video, we're just gonna run this. As for artillery, well, first of all, you get the best mortar in the game. Mortars are always good. Even if you don't smoke your tanks or something, you don't want to do that, which is fine. Mortars are still very, very useful. So I would always run mortars if you can. And for like offensive AA, you can run this, which is essentially, I think, a slightly better paladin. Solid, howitzer, 10 seconds aim time. Acceptable rate of fire and burst length. You can run the M110s, either the advanced one or the basic one. Even the M107 is actually fine. It's slightly lower AG, but also 60 points only and a lot more per card. So honestly, a bit underrated. You can really spam them. The Mars, I would only recommend for team games. In 1 vs 1, just not very impactful most of the time. Lars 2, solid. Lance can work. I would downvet it for sure. Even 50 point M109, also fine. You have a lot of choices. What I do actually these days for 1 vs 1 is just run 2 cards of these and spam the shit out of them. Mortar spam has always been strong, but I think a lot of people just forget about how strong it is sometimes. Tanks. One of the weaker tank types in the game, but it's okay, it's acceptable, it's fine. For 1 vs 1, I just run a card of Super Heavy. The 2A4, I think, is more than good enough. I think a 2A4 is also fine, but I feel the 2A4 is solid. It's cheaper, and it's very often just does the same job anyway. And then a 2A1 for a solid medium. The MX13 is either this or the Recon type version in my eyes is must-have. In this deck, I will run the Recon version, so I will not run an additional tank. But if it has incredibly good rate of fire, range, 12 AP, so it will deal with like IFVs and such, good accuracy. 3 front armor means that it doesn't die instantly to autocannons. Is incredibly strong. And of course, if you don't know, this is not an 13 RPM over a whole minute, like 60 seconds divided by 13. That's not its reload time. It fires like 12 rounds in a very fast burst and then has to reload for a long time. But very rarely will you actually need to fire more than 12 rounds like within a minute. So that thing has a crazy damage output. Some people like the Kyler. I'm not a fan because 12 armor is just not a lot for 70 points. Recon type Tiger, of course, very, very strong. As for Recon Infantry, a card of KCT in their links. Always nice to have for helo dropping. KCT are solid, not amazing, but solid. You can run Fanchbear if you like sneaking around. You can run Husaren or something in the Jeep or truck if you want to just a lot of like cheap Recon. These days I run a card of KCT in the wheeled transport, but again, Husaren I ran before actually, also perfectly fine, of course. Some people like BGS. I don't like them as much because they only have good stealth as opposed to very good on every other Recon infantry, except Fanchbear, which of course have exceptional. As for fighting Recon, I think obviously the Vercanning, although I don't think it's really that needed in my eyes. It's still nice to have, but it's just not nearly as impactful as the 84 AN or the P on PSC, which are just kind of must-haves. The Vercanning just lacks the armor and AP to these days really be that meaningful, but it's still more than solid. And then, like I said, I run a card of the MX13. Either one is fine, but in my eyes, you should have at least one of them. The Recon one, of course, less range, less accuracy, less AP, but does come with the stealth and the optics, so you know, it's a trade-off. And of course, lower availability, but 13 is still fine. Nothing in the vehicle type for me. That said, Mara VTS1, I guess in a mech that can be fine. Other than that, I wouldn't recommend. Vessel 1 Mark 20 for base defense, but there's nothing really significantly crazy in this tab. Or, you know, if you like AT launchers, you know, the TOW 2 or the Jaguar 2 or something like that can work fine. I'd probably go for this or the TOW 2 cheap. Helicopter, all you need really here is the escort. These days, actually, for 1 versus 1 again, I like to run the bow, not for offensive hero drops, but more like for defensive purposes. Because like I said, the AA struggles against seed and such, so having something like the bow to deal with a mobile, you know, anti-helo killer, again for defensive purposes, perfectly fine. I wouldn't use it offensively as much with 4 HE and relatively slow, dies easily, but it's, you know, very cheap. Planes, I think KWS, of course, is a must. It's virtually the best ASF in the game when it comes to card efficiency and such. I don't run a bomber, although the IDS, you know, I'm not a fan of it, but it's workable. If you really want an HE bomber, go for the IDS. I ran 2 cards of Peace Rhines. Peace Rhines are just good. I think at least 1 card you should have. 2 is, you know, if you really want them. Then I run a card of Upwetted OCU. Just basically a super heavy leader in that case. And, you know, in second line has 2 elite AIM 120s. And that's 55 activation points, as you see already. But what you can, of course, also do is, you know, if you struggle with helos as well, run the F104G. You know, let's say you don't put in the bow or man pads, and then you really want some anti-helo options. The F104G is a very, very, very good helo hunter. Or some people like to run a second card of ASFs, the MLU, because once again, if you struggle versus seed and the planes, then you can also just get more ASFs, I suppose. So those are the other good ASF choice. This is, you know, essentially the American Block 52. ECR, of course, if you want seed, it's the only seed you get. It's the rocket pod plane is not amazingly good, but if you want a rocket pod plane, we have one, but it struggles against like more than 2 or 3 armor, which most other rocket pods don't yet. And it's really all the good planes. You can, if you want to meme around a bit, you can run this cluster. It has actually good payload for the price, but not a very good speed or ECM. So it's very often just a one-way ticket. But yeah, that's roughly how that could look like. Like I said, especially when it comes to AA and, you know, utility infantry, there's a lot of differences you can see there, or artillery. And of course, as always, if you want to build this for team decks, just get more heavier tanks. That's usually just how the team decks differ from the 1 versus 1 decks. That said, I hope we learned something. I hope you found it useful, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Later!